Welcome along, everyone, to another episode of Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone. Thank you for tuning in. Controversial but very, very important topic to discuss tonight, and that is the referendum on cannabis law reform, as some are calling it, with special guest Aaron Ironside. Before we do that, though, just a couple of administrative things. Don't forget the YouTube channel. If you're not already a subscriber, please go and subscribe there. You can find the YouTube channel at mondaynightLiveShow.com. There's a link in the show description here, mondaynightLiveShow.com. The Facebook page, Monday Night Live Show. That's facebook.com/Monday Night Live Show. Please go and like the Facebook page. Starting from next week, we will be live streaming from that page. Hopefully all of the technical issues have all been worked out, all the kinks have been ironed out in the system. And lastly but not leastly, we really rely on your support to do this work, this little independent media startup, just in its infancy, growing away at a humble little pace. But I know that I'm hearing a lot of feedback from a lot of people who are watching episodes either on the night or after the fact, actually. And so I know that there's a growing support base out there for that. You can support this work that we're doing at Left Foot Media for as little as $1 a month. Doesn't get much easier than that, does it? And you can support Left Foot Media on patreon.com. So it's patreon.com/Left Foot Media. You can see the little chyron if I point in the right place on the screen down here somewhere. You can see that little chyron there, and that's the details for the Left Foot Media Patreon page to give some support. Thank you again for tuning in tonight, and let's get straight into tonight's topic. Let me bring in our guest. With me tonight, I have Aaron Ironside, who is the spokesperson for the Say Nope to Dope campaign. Aaron, thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Now, I'm going to give you a proper little introduction here, as we always do, a good little bio. So let's do that now. Aaron Ironside rose to prominence in the 1990s as the anchor of Radio Hauraki's popular morning Pirates breakfast show, back in the halcyon days of Radio Hauraki. The young rock DJ fully embraced the sex, drugs and rock and roll lifestyle that accompanied his newfound fame. Aaron quickly turned his occasional marijuana use into a daily habit that consumed his life. In time, he realised that his drug addiction was now affecting his mental health, exacerbating his symptoms of anxiety and depression. In 1998, Aaron quit the high-profile job and decided to deal with his drug problem. Once clean, he began working in the not-for-profit sector, putting his master's degree in psychology to work. In 2012, he started AI counselling and coaching, helping hundreds of clients to find freedom from many different types of addiction and substance abuse. Aaron, thanks for being with us here tonight. Let's just jump straight into it, shall we? Can you just tell us a little bit more about your story, just to establish your bona fides, if you like, about your connection to this issue and why it matters to you?
Yeah. I kind of chuckle when I think about my history with cannabis, because I first tried it with some teenage friends at high school, but somehow I kind of didn't hear the instructions right about how you're supposed to smoke the stuff. So not much happened, and I didn't think for a long time that it was anything other than kind of smoking incense, really. And then one day, I think I kind of happened upon the way you were supposed to do it, and I was like, wow, that is an amazing experience. And it really did hook me very, very quickly, and it wasn't long before me and my flatmates would spend every spare moment as soon as we got home from the radio station. I was working with other radio guys. We would just go and buy some cannabis. We would sit in the lounge. We would watch sport. We would fall asleep, and we would rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
For a little while. That kind of was a lot of fun, to be honest.
Yeah.
Until one day I realized, actually, I didn't know if I was allowed to do anything else now. And every day was like every other. And I realized the only thing I really think about is when I can get high next.
Yeah. Tell me, did you ever find yourself developing tolerance to and having to increase to get that high, or was it just a constant thing for you?
No, I think tolerance is a very real issue. For me, there are a couple of things we did to sort of increase the potency. One, we cut a Sprite bottle in half and we used to put it into a bucket of water and draw the smoke up through the Sprite bottle, and then you would inhale that as quickly as you could. At other times, we would get the resin that you get from the cannabis plant, and we would have it on tin foil and knives in the kitchen, and we'd be lighting the tin foil. I'd hate to think what kind of carcinogens I was inhaling along with the cannabis oil, but all in aid of trying to get a bigger high, a deeper high, because, yeah, as time goes on, you become immune to the stuff.
My personal family experiences, I've got a couple of close family members who I've seen who have had very, very negative experiences with cannabis, just absolutely detrimental to their well-being, their stability, their social cohesion. One of them had almost claimed his life, suicide. Thankfully, that didn't eventuate. But it seems to me there's a lot of these stories out there, yet in this debate, those real world lived experience seem to be downplayed a lot. Is that your take on things as well?
They are very much an inconvenient truth, that's for sure. Instead, what people want to say is mostly the other story of I've smoked for years and it hasn't caused me any problems. And look, we know there are people for whom they have dodged the bullet. Yeah. But too many have not. And as one British expert says, smoking cannabis is like playing Russian roulette, because the assumption is we know the mental health history of our family. But as this doctor has pointed out, things like psychosis are often the skeletons in the closet in a family. So it might well be that someone a generation or two ago had some kind of mental illness issue, but the family has kept it on the down low. So you don't know that actually that's in your DNA. But yeah, there are so many stories, and recently we asked our supporter base to tell us why they intended to vote no. And I'll be honest, we got over 900 responses, and we had about a couple of hundred with stories of either family members, people in the community that had seen firsthand whose lives had been ruined by cannabis. And it was very sad to realize just how devastating this has been.
Tell me, there's been some new polling data out in the last 12, 24 hours. Is that right? Can you just give us a bit of an overview of that?
Well, One News has been doing the Colmar-Brunton poll periodically over the last sort of 6 months or so on this issue. And today's result shows the same trend as it has from the beginning, and that is the no vote is ahead. We have lost a little bit of ground, so the no vote is down from 51 to 49%, and the yes vote is up from 39 to 40%. Leaving about 11% undecided. What's fascinating, of course, from our point of view, is we've watched these very flash ads that the Yes campaign have had on the telly, and they've admitted that they spent $300,000 broadcasting those. And I can only guess that they're a little bit disappointed that after all that money, they haven't moved the needle. They've got 1% increase. So it really does show that most Kiwis just get it, that this is not good news.
Tell me, why do you think that is, that they haven't been able to shift the needle? Because we're going to talk about their campaign in a minute, but I'm surprised by that. Do you think there's a factor here that's at play?
Well, I think we've got a generational divide. I think, broadly speaking, older Kiwis are conservative in their view towards this topic, and younger Kiwis are more liberal. So I do think that we have a generational issue. One can only wonder how the vote would go if those under 18 got a say in this, that's for sure. I think it's just experience that older Kiwis have seen and heard enough. Whereas I think that sort of confirmation bias when you're young and you're a bit bulletproof and you think you're doing fine, your assumption is everybody's having the same experience as me. Certainly, I think there's a class divide here, that most ordinary, particularly Pākehā middle-class Kiwis, have not factored in how vulnerable communities are so deeply affected by issues like this, and not just the issue of cannabis, but its flow-on effects of poverty, and then the crime that flows on from poverty. These issues are a long way away from the lives of many Kiwis.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a minute, actually, because I think that's a really important point you raised. Before we go on, I should say to those who've tuned in, if you want to ask questions, put them in the comments section, and I'll make sure that we ask Aaron. This is a good opportunity to ask any question you want to about this issue. It seems to me, Aaron, that there's a couple of issues wrapped up in here very, very cunningly from a strategic perspective from the other side. It seems they've wrapped up the question of perhaps medicinal use of cannabis or cannabinoid products and recreational use. They're two different things, and I think we've got to separate them. Is that your take on this?
I think they've played into the fact that their research will have shown them that many Kiwis did not know that we legalised medicinal cannabis in December of last year. That seems to have escaped many people's attention. So they've leveraged that as a kind of way of talking about this whole topic. I mean, that being said, the Drug Foundation and Normal, for that matter, have made it pretty clear that medicinal has always been the pathway to advocating for the recreational use of cannabis. And so this is not exactly a surprise tactic. But to be clear, medical is currently legal. There are some challenges. It appears that those who need medicinal cannabis are struggling to afford it. It's not easy to get. But those problems can be solved by addressing the legislation that is in place. Our concern is that if you open up recreational to serve this medicinal need, what you get is self-medication. Yeah. You get people deciding, oh, my doctor won't actually prescribe this stuff for me, but I think I need it. I think it would help. Or you get people turning up at the cannabis shop being told by their doctor, I want you to use a CBD product, one that is just for pain relief, that does not have the ingredient that causes you to get high, the THC. But of course, once you're in the shop, you might decide, hey, why not some CBD and some THC? Yeah. And now, of course, we can see some research that says a large number of those patients who will use medicinal marijuana will go on to become recreational users.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That blurring of the lines I always found extremely troubling. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago hearing talk about the idea of medicinal cannabis that you would grow yourself. And I thought to myself, well, I don't bake up my own codeine. If it's medicinal, you have it prescribed and it's in a proper controlled kind of environment.
Yeah. Well, because marijuana has these two active ingredients, CBD and THC, it's impossible for someone growing at home to be able to tell you what their plant's composition is. Yeah. So you can't have medication at home without any sense of how strong it is. I mean, at least if you buy Panadol or ibuprofen over the counter, you can still see how strong it is. But if you're growing it at home, you have no idea what it is you're growing.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think this brings me to another point that I think is worthy of discussion here, and that is the issue of the distinction between what we might call your granddad's cannabis and cannabis today. It's a very different potency, right?
Yeah, we've called it Woodstock weed. I'm not sure that'll mean a lot, but a few of us know what Woodstock is. The weed of the 1970s was around 3% THC. So that's a very low strength version of cannabis. And so to smoke a joint, you would certainly get high, but fairly low strength kind of activity. In the 90s, it was already up to around 10%. Now, the street cannabis is around 30% THC. Wow. And the government's advocating for a limit through the shops of 15% THC, but 15% is still 5 times higher in strength than the Woodstock weed of the 1970s. But get this, the edible products are getting up in the 80s and 90% THC. For example, in Colorado, one shop is selling a can of cannabis-infused soda, so just a can of soft drink, and it says that it has 10 servings in it. Well, when in your life have you ever opened a can of drink and thought, I need to find 9 mates to share this with? You're going to drink all 10 servings in one go, and each of those servings is the strength of a joint. It's a very different product we're talking about.
Yeah, because I think this is important, right? Because it's not just, people think someone in Ponsonby smoking a joint, listening to the Doobie Brothers. They have this very sort of harmless idea, but edibles and everything else are a very different market now, right?
Yeah, and again, much harder to control in terms of usage. I know, for example, one of the few times I tried edibles, it went terribly wrong. A friend had brought around a tray of brownies and said, look, this has got, cannabis in it. So I had a piece, and half an hour later, nothing had happened. So I had another piece, still nothing happened. I thought, I'll have a third piece. And then we went off to the pub. And I was sitting there in the pub about an hour later, and a friend turned to me and said, if you're going to blow chunks, you need to go to the bathroom. Apparently, I turned deathly pale. I went and sat in the disabled toilet, held on to the handrail, and in my mind, the cubicle went end over end for half an hour, and it was not a fun experience at all. These edibles are a very different proposition, and they're resulting to particularly young people finding themselves in emergency department, rather accident emergency departments in hospitals around the world, because they're having experiences that are not enjoyable. They think they're dying, and they are, reaching out for help because they're not sure what's happening.
Tell me, if you could sum it up in a statement or two, what do you think the stakes are here? What are the risks? What are the stakes that we're actually playing with? You've talked about playing a game of roulette here. What are some of the stakes, the very real consequences of this referendum if it was to be legalised?
It's basically that commercialisation wins the day. I've no doubt that those on the yes side of this genuinely hope for a world in which cannabis is sold through regulated stores and it's a regulated product. But in truth, this is what happens. A new market is established. Now, the black market loses some clientele. They're not very happy about that, so they start trying to find new customers and win old customers back. The new market is disappointed that their share of the market is so low. Overseas, we see the split is mostly 30% legal, 70% black market. So these two markets now go into competition with each other. And what we're finding, of course, is the black market is empowered by this. This is what the New Zealand Police said, that this type of legislation empowers the black market. It tells them who to target, young people who aren't allowed to buy it from the shops, and to offer them high-potency, low-cost products. So what are the stakes? The stakes are simply this, that the market gets flooded with cannabis, and that drives the price down, which means you have to sell more of the stuff to make a profit. And so what we see is that instead of harm reduction, you get increase in use. And particularly in two areas is that problematic. The developing brains of young people, who will be more prone to becoming lifelong addicts. The perfect customer for a store, by the way, is someone who's addicted. And vulnerable communities who will have the money that they can't afford to spend on this product extracted from them. In Colorado, Brendan, there is one cannabis dispensary for every 47 adults in the poorest communities of Denver.
Wowzers, that's mind-boggling. Let's speak about the black market, because I think this is one of the great myths. I had a real eye-opening experience in watching the Netflix documentary series Murder Mountain, which is about the cannabis mountain where a lot of the stuff is grown in California, and they talk about this very fact. This idea that we'll get rid of the black market, everyone will transfer into the system, they'll start paying tax, they'll start paying all of the fees associated with running a legitimate business. And a lot of these guys say, well, it just cost too much, so I went back to black market. And a lot of people forget that, even December of last year, the media in our country was saying, we've got a problem with black market tobacco. It's been a problem for years, and that's a legal product already. So the idea that black markets just go away when you can keep growing it that way and selling it without all the regulatory costs really is quite naive, right?
Yeah. Well, you've taken all the risk out of it from the user's standpoint. They've got no reason not to visit the tinny shop because you've told them it's not illegal for you. The only person doing something illegal in that transaction is the tinny shop. And guess what? They've never been that fussed on the law to begin with. So, nothing is going to change in that regard except now focus. Because you have to win back the clientele that you've lost, and you have to start finding new products that are going to attract new kinds of customers. So this is a serious problem that not only will the black market not go away, it will double down. It will increase its efforts to keep its slice of the market. So in Colorado and in Canada, both markets have had very similar changes in number of total cannabis sold. They've both gone from about $5.5 billion US per year pre-legalization, and they're both now, as different markets, selling $7 billion worth.
Wow.
So
that's just expansion, right? That's all that is.
Just grows the market.
Yeah. Wowzers. And of course, I guess the incentive to stay in the black market is you don't have to give as much of your money away to the government.
Right. And look, let's be honest, this is not an easy thing. The current legislation that's before us that we're supposed to be voting on is 160 pages long. So if you'd like to become a regulated distributor of cannabis, for a start, you're going to have to be the sort of person who can read 160 pages worth of legal terms and work out what you're allowed to do and how you're supposed to do it. And practically, can we really imagine gangs showing up at the bank and opening accounts, ringing accountants and saying, can we be GST registered? Let alone all of the compliance regulations, both practical and financial. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. We saw a bit of that really with the gun buyback scheme where the gangs just said, no, we're not going to give back our guns, and that was sort of the end of it. It's I don't imagine they're going to give up their market share. Tell me, what about people who would say, well, look, Aaron, alcohol's legal, causes lots of harms. We don't have prohibitions on that one. We have age limits and where you can sell it. Why can't we do the same with cannabis?
To which we would say, how's alcohol going? Not exactly a success story. Alcohol and tobacco are already running rife. We don't need a third harmful substance legalized. What we need to do is better, for sure, at the health and education programs in terms of reducing harm and really encouraging young people not to get involved with cannabis in the first place. But what we've seen from overseas is that legalization changes both the behavior and the attitude of young people. And understandably, I mean, if you walk past a cannabis shop on your way to school every day of your life, you're going to start to think smoking cannabis is just not such a dangerous thing to do. I'm not sure if it normalizes it, but the research tells us that young people stop associating cannabis as a risk-taking behavior. They now start to see it as not risky at all. So, yeah, we could do what we've done with alcohol and with tobacco, but why would we want to repeat that mistake?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because it seems to me it's not really an argument in favour of cannabis. It's more of an argument against alcohol, which I'm okay with as a man who enjoys a whiskey. But it seems to me that what's missed as well in that whole debate is that alcohol, you can actually sit and have a social drink, and that's the end of it. It's the abuse of alcohol that really the problems flow from. Whereas cannabis, it's an intoxicant. The only reason you take it is to get out of your head, right? You don't simply sit there to relax. There's a whole intoxicating effect that you're trying to seek from the very use of it.
Well, dosage is really important. So in one standard alcoholic drink, there's 14 grams of alcohol. In one joint, there's 0.1 of a gram of THC. So very different kind of dosage. But as you rightly say, one standard drink does not make the average person drunk or intoxicated in any way, shape or form. But try smoking a whole joint without getting high.
Yeah. We've had a question coming from Shane. He says, have any countries that have legalised cannabis since reversed their legislation due to harm or increased crime? I'd love to hear your take on this. I'd love to know if there's any, but I guess to me it's also a bit of a red herring in one sense, because once you're making that kind of money, there's a big incentive not to do much about it, right? But have any reversed it?
No, once this is out of the box, it's out of the box. And that's the problem, is that you can't go back. And that's really one of our big arguments, is why are we skipping so many steps with this kind of legislation? We're skipping over decriminalization. We're really skipping over legalization all the way to commercialization, setting up a new kind of industry that we've never seen before. We're doing too much too soon. Why not slow down? Because in some of these other jurisdictions that have legalized, it's been not enough time for us to really see what's going to happen. Why are we rushing? Let's take a pause. Let's watch and see if things turn out the way that has been suggested they will, because early evidence is it's not shaping up the way the yes people said it would.
Someone else has asked, could punishing dealers but making it legal for people to grow, say, 2 plants at home with a THC rating of only 3% be a good compromise?
Well, again, we refer to the earlier point that it's very difficult for an ordinary home grower to monitor the strength or even know about the strength. In fact, it takes a laboratory to work out how much THC is in a cannabis product. So during the regulation process, we'll have to set up laboratories that will be testing products, and it's quite an elaborate sort of scheme. So very hard to monitor that part. What we do have, which I think people need to understand, is we already have an informal style of decriminalization now. And that is that the police for now 20 years have been applying discretion to this topic. They know that if they encounter someone who is simply using cannabis, that they are supposed to give them a pre-charge warning. So it's not even the case right now that whilst it might be a technicality that it's against the law, you will not face any real punishment. Yeah. The only people who get charged with possession are people who are doing something else at the same time. So if the policeman says, I can see you've got some stolen goods, and an ounce of cannabis, well, we'll throw that into the charge list. But in the last 3 years, only 16 New Zealanders received home detention or a jail sentence because of cannabis possession. And in every single one of those cases, it was only one charge among many.
So that's less than what? What's that, about 6 a year? Less than 6 a year?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just simply not true that we are locking people up for this. We haven't for years. The police have no interest in this. A good friend of mine is a senior police officer here in Auckland, and he said to me, if one of my staff arrested someone for smoking a joint, they'd appear in my office, have to give me a please explain as to why they were wasting police resources. So we only ever target growers and dealers in New Zealand. And even under the new legislation, that would need to continue. Because if you own a regulated store, you're going to want to make sure the cops are shutting down the tinny shops in your neighborhood. So there's no way the police are just going to suddenly wash their hands of this topic.
Tell me, another question that's coming from Bridget. She says, what about the argument that some people have made that legalising cannabis could help to reduce meth production and use, so use of methamphetamine?
Well, what is true is that we have seen in those who use meth, the stronger substances, almost all of them have a history with cannabis. Now, we know it doesn't work the other way. We know plenty of cannabis users don't graduate to the stronger stuff. But it's almost entirely true the other way around, that those who use the stronger stuff have used cannabis. Look, at the end of the day, we just have to face the logic problem. You cannot defeat addiction with addiction. As long as people are having to augment and enhance reality, they are making reality harder to deal with. In my day job, I'm a counsellor. And so I see this in many ways all the time, that whenever we start experimenting with any kind of fantasy, and of course, cannabis produces a fantasy experience, it's making reality less and less interesting, less and less easy to deal with. After all, real life has pain, has problem, but this life that you create for yourself when you smoke seems free of all those things. So really, we're no better off to have people addicted to cannabis, even though we understand that other drugs are even worse again, that won't make cannabis any less harmful.
It seems to me too, there's a bit of a myth around this, that in the sense that people seem to negate the very real positive impact that prohibition can have, and also the fact that we're talking about a substance that has been prohibited universally, from the start, versus say other products where, like with alcohol, where it's been freely available, then you try and prohibit it, go the other way. They're two very different cycles, it seems. But also, prohibition of a product, it's absolutely must have an impact on people's behaviours, in the sense of they use the law as a basic guide. A lot of people would for their moral conduct or the choices they make if it's not available.
Well, it's even stronger than that, Brendan. It's this idea of the coercion of the law. Again, in my work as a counsellor, so often when I'm talking to people, I'm thinking to myself, why didn't you see me a year ago, 3 years ago? People let their problems get way out of hand before they seek help by themselves. But the coercion of the law looks like this. You come before a judge, and the judge says, you know what, I could give you a criminal record for your cannabis use, but instead I'm going to send you to a drug rehab program in lieu of getting any time, in lieu of getting a record. And of course, being forced to go and get some help is often the only thing that really truly works for people. Because when you're stuck in the cycle of addiction, we know that denial is one of the huge problems. I don't have a problem. And yet the law can help you see you do have a problem and make you go and get help before you otherwise would.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, tell me, the question of Māori communities, as I said, a lot of people tend to think some guy in Ponsonby listening to his Pink Floyd having a joint. But in reality, the communities in Northland are probably going to be absolutely hammered by this kind of stuff. They get out of sight, out of mind. I hear people saying, a friend of mine said to me recently, well, the current laws are a disadvantage to the Māori community. They get picked up on these cannabis charges, whereas perhaps they'd have a better shot at life if that wasn't a charge that was on the table because it was legal. Can we address those issues, though, without going to this extreme of legalising cannabis, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's certainly true that vulnerable communities get targeted. After all, if you're going to start a business, you go where the clientele is, you go where the customers are, and sadly, too often, that is in communities of colour. And that means that the very families who can't afford to be spending their money on this are the ones that end up propping up the businesses. Because as a business model, you can't build a business on someone who wants to have a joint once a month or once a year and listen to Pink Floyd. That is not going to be enough. You need daily users. And so you've got to work hard to make addicts. Look, I worked for 6 months in Manurewa with an organisation helping families through drug addiction, through cannabis use. And I saw firsthand the kind of flow-on neglect issues that occurred because of this. Families without money, whose children don't have the right kind of clothes or don't get the right kind of medical care because there is no money, because all the money is spent on weed. And these flow-on effects are terrible. It's been interesting that we've posted some research around how cannabis changes your brain over the long term and increases the likelihood of violent offending. Most people, of course, think, yeah, but when you smoke a joint, you feel all relaxed, happy, you would never hurt anybody. And that's true. But what about the next day when your wife gives you a hard time because there's no money for the power bill, and suddenly you have a fight, and suddenly your brain has changed through cannabis use? Because one of the things we know medically now is that if you start using cannabis in your teens, it literally shrinks your brain.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot more to this, right? And again, that goes back to the potency and the chemical makeup. This is not, as you call it, Woodstock weed. This is something very different. What you've mentioned already, Canada, you've mentioned Colorado. What are some of those overseas effects that you're drawing on? Because you hear a lot about people talking about overseas experiences, but obviously there must be research from overseas, otherwise you wouldn't have mounted this sort of campaign that you've adopted here.
Well, two particularly make me very sad to say, because I work in the mental health arena. So to hear that as a result of legalization, we've seen now a dramatic increase in the amount of hospitalizations for cannabis, and mostly psychosis is the problem, people losing touch with reality in very painful and scary ways. In Colorado, they've seen the youth suicide rate for those who use cannabis 7 times higher than the national average. There's some terrible stuff that's happening. In Canada, for instance, every single day in Canada, since they've legalized, 30 teenagers have been hospitalized because of their cannabis reaction, cannabis-induced psychosis.
How many was that? 30 a day?
30 a day. In Washington State, their poison center reported a 300% increase in phone calls to their poison hotline. 80% of those calls, teenagers who, again, having cannabis-induced effects that they don't know how to cope with and think that they've poisoned themselves.
Wowzers. I mean, look, I hadn't even heard some of those effects. That's just, again, it's mind-boggling, really, when you think about it. Someone's asked a question which relates to a question I was just about to ask you, and they've said, I understand the Drug Council is advocating for legalising. And they've said, is there tax-funded advertising available to campaign against legalising? I was going to ask you about this, the Drug Foundation, and you've already mentioned $300,000 they've already spent, and they're probably going to spend about that much again. Where is this money coming from? And what is this big cannabis that I keep hearing people talk about overseas and here?
Well, we can't get a straight answer as to exactly where the money has come from. It's a little bit confusing. The Drug Foundation pays for all their infrastructure and staff through government money, and yet technically the money spent on the campaign has not come from that government source. But that seems to be a bit blurry for most of us, given that the rest of their operation is funded by the government, and those staff certainly seem to be working on this campaign. Big cannabis, we're not entirely clear as to, there are 3 options really. We've got big tobacco, who are looking for their next product because they know that their days of selling cigarettes are numbered. We've got big pharma, who are just simply looking for their next drug of choice to sell. Or what we've got, and probably the most likely scenario here, we know there are some players, particularly overseas, who are keen to get into the market and who unashamedly want their business to be as big tobacco and big pharma. And so they are mimicking the style of business. And one of the interesting comebacks, which we want to bring some clarity to, is that we've heard the Drug Foundation say, oh yeah, but the legislation says that you can only have 20% of the market. No one business can own more than 20% of the market. Couple of problems. Well, how big is the market? I mean, the market is changing size all the time. But certainly, if we went off the basis of their projected tax take, which is a $200 million tax take, that means that the industry is $1 billion a year, which means that a 20% business is a $200 million a year business. And most people like you and me, Brenda, do not have the kind of cash to get into the market to grow a $200 million business.
So the reality is then that it seems that it's highly possible here, or even likely, that there are financial vested interests who are funding the Yes campaign. Is that a possibility?
Oh, it's certainly a possibility. And without doubt, there are those, of course, who have a vested interest in the Yes. Interestingly, we are the opposite on our side. We have some people in the SAM coalition who work in the drug testing arena, and they've commented to me, "Hey, if we win, if the no vote wins, I lose money. I should really be supporting the yes vote so that I can get more money testing drugs." But they're so convinced that this is a bad idea that they're willing to put their own business fortunes on the line here. But somebody stands to profit, that's for sure.
Tell me, do you think we're a little bit vulnerable at the moment in the sense that culturally there's been a rise in perhaps you might call pharma skepticism, big pharma. There's also the tendency towards natural products. You put natural on the front of something and everyone says, oh, I'll buy that version of it. The sense that weed is presented as a natural thing, do you think we have a cultural vulnerability in this regard, thinking, oh, this must be better?
Well, I think you're right. It's certainly an argument we'll hear a lot that it's in nature, so it must be good, as if there aren't other poisonous things in nature that we wouldn't recommend you using. We don't recommend that you handle a rattlesnake, but they're in nature as well. But I think it does lend to a point that we would certainly concede some ground on, and it's this, that the fact that cannabis has been illegal has meant that there's not a lot of research done on the effects of cannabis. And we can see that the CBD part of cannabis is very helpful for some medical conditions. And so we would hope that there will be some more research to find out exactly what can be utilized from cannabis. But in the same breath, we know the THC component is the one connected with the negative outcomes. Psychosis, paranoia, anxiety, depression, they all go up because of the THC part. So it's not an easy story, the story of cannabis. It certainly has some benefits, but I think it's best left in the hands of doctors, and that's where we'd like to see it.
Tell me, the referendum that's coming up, let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly are we voting on? Are we voting on a final bill? Are we voting on this sort of amorphous idea that it would go back to Parliament and they'll craft a bill? What is the vote? What are we being asked to say yes or no to?
Well, there is definitely a draft piece of legislation that would go before Parliament. It's 160 pages long. It's a long document. So, yes, it would get to go through select committee. It would get to be refined and have some of the edges taken off it. But the basic referendum question is about the legalizing of recreational cannabis, not medicinal, recreational cannabis. It's a yes or a no. And after that, the politicians will do what they do. It's a non-binding referendum, which is a shame, as always, that we ask the public and then reserve the right to ignore them. Yeah. That's our chance to send the politicians a clear signal that we wish for them to pause this and to not proceed with this really hasty piece of legislation.
So in effect then, the reality is, and I've had some dealings with the political system in the last couple of years and specific pieces of legislation up close and personal, the reality is that you could vote yes, for example. Let's say the yes vote wins the day, and people have got in mind what even the draft bill looks like, but the final result could be absolutely and very extremely different, because that's how the political system works. So there's really not even a guarantee of what you're going to get, even if you're supportive of this, right?
Well, that's a cynical view, but who would blame you for having it? You're right that we don't know what changes they might introduce throughout the process. For us, we realize there is no piece of legislation that's acceptable. Legalization does not work. It's well-intentioned, it's a lovely aspiration, but unfortunately the black market is too strong to overcome, and the downstream effects just simply do not outweigh the costs.
Couple of quick questions to finish with. In a 30 seconds or so, can you tell me why, if you had someone you had to on the street and they said, well, okay, convince me, Aaron, I'm not sure, why should I vote against this? Just what's the basic reason that you'd give me to say no?
Ultimately, it would be about young people. Their developing brains that don't finish developing until 25 are so much more susceptible to the effects of THC. They're so much more likely to become lifelong users and addicts, and so much more likely to experience the kinds of mental health outcomes that we as a culture said we were trying to fix. You can't have it both ways. You can't say we want our youth suicide rate to go down, we want our mental health to be good and well, and promote something that simply will not bring about those effects. And what happens when a generation is affected like this? We're going to reap the consequences of that for decades to come.
Tell me, just to finish with, obviously your campaign is asking people to tick no in the referendum. What else, though, can people do? How do they get better informed? How can they have the conversation with other people around them? Because you're not dealing with the same budget. How do people actually get engaged and informed on this issue?
Well, we've done a good job, I think, of putting together what we've called briefing sheets at our website, saynope2dope.org.nz. There's one in particular I'd love for people to take a look at and potentially download as a PDF. That's the 20 reasons. It's a very short summary that gives a nice broad coverage of the legal and medical issues that are at play here. We think that's a really good starting point. For those who want to do the deep dive, they can go and look country by country and really find out what's going on here. I think what's really important is that we educate ourselves so that this doesn't become some personal preference issue, but rather we allow ourselves to be influenced by what is actually true, not what we hope would be true.
Couple of quick questions have come in that I think are worth just covering off. Someone suggested that perhaps this bill is about giving us the ability to grow our own weed, but it's obviously more than that, right? We've covered that tonight, but it is. Someone must have come in late.
You certainly will be able to grow cannabis under this regime. 2 plants per adult, so a maximum of 4 per home. The obvious question being, and who's going to stop the teenagers from clipping some buds on the way off to school one day? Yeah. That's a very dangerous thing to try and monitor. But yeah, you were going to be able to be a green fairy, would you believe, and gift up to 40 joints to another adult. As long as you don't take any money for it, you can give somebody 40 joints just because you fancy doing it.
Oh my gosh. I mean, what do you make of that? Another question someone says, what about young people who are given weed that is laced with other drugs or poisons? Won't legalisation maybe offer some protection to them?
Well, we're not entirely sure how this logic is supposed to work because the legal store isn't allowed to sell to young people. Although we all know rather practically if the age is 20, as is being suggested here, it won't take much for a teenager to find a 20-year-old who's willing to buy them some. But in reality, what we've seen overseas is that the black market starts specializing in the edibles and in the other products. Vaping, of course, is going to be a huge market that they will try and lean into. As for the other drugs, I mean, that's a risk, I suppose, for sure. But much more of a risk is simply, in a sense, gifting the young people to a black market who now know their job is to provide high THC, low-cost products. And to give you the specifics of that, Brendan, in Canada currently, legal cannabis is $10 a gram, black market cannabis is $5 a gram, and it's twice as strong.
Well, you don't have to be an economist to understand how that works then. Aaron, thanks for being with us here tonight. Just quickly again, what's the website address where people can go and get themselves all that important information?
saynope2dope.org.nz.
Aaron, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. It was a real privilege and a real honour to have you on the show to unpack and to be able to talk about these issues. So thanks again, mate. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side, our fears are done. Oh, the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.